Well, welcome everybody to Two Bald Guys. My name's Eric Giordano. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, also known as WIPS.
And I'm Dave Anderson. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at WIPS, 39 years working mainly for government and enjoying my retirement and doing some volunteer work for an outstanding organization. Eric, tell us a little bit about what WIPS does so that our one single viewer can have some appreciation of the great work that this organization is up to.
Well, we aim to please our viewer. So WIPS is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system. We've been around since 2007, so in our 12th year. We educate and engage citizens. We try to develop future leaders and also try to help young people become more civically active. And we help communities address issues that they care about, particularly by bringing the resources of the University of Wisconsin to bear. So Dave, the question everybody wants to know, our viewer that is, why two bald guys?
Well, I'm going to answer that question on a couple of different levels. First of all, obviously, we share the same hairline. And ironically, as Eric, as you know, Eric, as we've traveled the state meeting with people, talking about WIPS programs and the services that WIPS provides, oftentimes we wear the same style and color of clothes. So we begin those conversations often by saying, I bet you're wondering why two bald guys in a blue shirt and khaki slacks are here meeting with you today. So it seemed appropriate to call this show Two Bald Guys. But on another level, I think this has really been, this is important because you and I have had some great conversations about civic engagement and public policy as we've traveled the state going to different meetings. And to take these conversations public in a forum like this and to have special guests join us, I think is kind of a special thing.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty deep. I'm a little disappointed that you didn't get the blue shirt memo today, by the way. Because for me, it really is about the fact that you and I have planetary-sized heads because of our massive brain power, and I just felt like we had to share that with the world, right?
There you go.
And for example, when we were contemplating the title of this, we spent hours of research, right? We could have named ourselves Two Bald Fellows. We could have called ourselves Two Bald Personages or Dos Amigos Calvos. But we did our research and we chose Two Bald Guys. That's the kind of hard-hitting, stuff you're going to get from us.
Absolutely.
So speaking of hard-hitting, we're going to take a minute to acknowledge our one confirmed viewer, Luke Rudolph. And he just also happens to double as our producer. So say hello, Luke.
Hello, Luke.
Awesome. Please take note that Luke is a paid representative of an attractive younger demographic because Dave and I strongly believe that young people should occasionally be heard. So thank you, Luke. And occasionally we might allow you to have your microphone on. Speaking of which, we asked Luke to come up with one hard-hitting story from this week right out of the news. And maybe we'll make a little comment about that. Luke, what story did you find for us?
So this comes from California, from Vallejo. The city's planning commissioner has resigned after he threw his cat into the air during a Zoom meeting, where city officials also said he drank alcohol and used derogatory language. It's a headline straight out of 2020.
Wow, that is a pretty hair-raising story, Dave. What's your takeaway?
It's hard to even comment on that, but all I can say is I'm glad local government here isn't as exciting as that.
Well, I was thinking about how, once again, we see how local government is the future. We talk about state and national government being dysfunctional, but, we always say local government, that's where the future is. And there we have it. So anyway, if you have ideas for incredibly hard-hitting news stories for us to share next week, viewers, feel free to email us at info@wips.org. That's WIPPS.org. Okay, well, now we're going to get right to our guests. We have, of course, our advertised guests that I'll introduce in a minute. And we also have a mystery guest that's going to follow him. So we're really excited about that. It's kind of hush-hush, but we'll get to that later. So our first guest, though, is Brett Barker, a professor of U.S. history at UW-Stevens Point. Today, we're talking with Dr. Barker about the impact of the Spanish flu on society and what we can learn about that era as we contemplate the current global pandemic of COVID-19. And so if you have any questions or comments for Dr. Barker or about the show, please note them in the Facebook chat box. Welcome, Dr. Barker, and this must truly be an honor for you to be with us, right?
It is. I'm particularly pleased that you had asked somebody that still has at least some hair left on the program. So thanks for that.
Well, we try to be representative of all demographic types. So, Dr. Barker, I guess I'm supposed to ask a question, right? Okay. So why don't you just start by telling us, a little bit about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic generally, and, its impact globally and here in Wisconsin as well.
Sure. Well, it was a stunning pandemic, even in modern terms. Modern estimates are that at least 50 and perhaps 100 million people died during this pandemic. And of course, when the world's population was much lower, just within Wisconsin, there were over 100,000 cases and about 8,500 deaths. So more Wisconsinites died in the 1980 pandemic than died in World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars combined. And it raged mostly for a fairly brief period in the fall of 1918, and it did have a small second wave in early 1919.
Wow, that's pretty devastating.
I'm struck by the fact that there's a lot of differences, of course, between now and 1918, but there's also a lot of similarities, I think, between what went on then and what's going on now. Could you maybe make some comment about that?
Sure. I think there are some amazing similarities. A couple of differences I would say that kind of separated is that, first of all, they didn't understand what viruses were. So that was one real difference. They didn't know exactly what was causing it. The other sort of frightening thing about 1918 was that it tended to kill people in the primes of their lives. We're not exactly sure why, but the highest mortality was amongst people between the ages of 25 and 40. There is some thinking that those who came down with the flu after they recovered, about 20% of them eventually developed pneumonia. And of them, about 50% developed what was technically called heliotrope cyanosis. But in fact, it was a horrible way to die called the Blue Death, where essentially your body was starved of oxygen. You began to feel your lungs filled with a black liquid, and your body slowly turned blue, and you died essentially because your lungs couldn't function. Those were two ways. It was very, very different. And I think particularly frightening to people back then. But the similarities, I think we probably will spend a lot of time on because there are so many. I think that it was a time in which it was particularly likely that there could be a global pandemic because people were moving all over the earth in the final days of World War I. So soldiers and the like were traveling around the world in a way that seems much more modern to us than people would have been mostly in the early 20th century. People could see it slowly going across the landscape. Wisconsin was no different. It arrived in Milwaukee, went to Madison, eventually found its way to sort of smaller population centers like Eau Claire or Wausau, La Crosse, and eventually to even the most rural of communities saw the pandemic hit in 1980.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I'm really curious to know about response to the pandemic and what did that look like from national government, state government, local government, and of course later, how does that compare to what you see we are doing in this pandemic?
Really interesting parallels. When the outbreak became very serious in southeastern Wisconsin, and it was clear it was going to continue to spread across the state, the governor issued essentially an order shutting down the state, something very similar to Safer at Home, that called for the closing of all businesses, schools, public institutions, and certainly retail businesses, that is. So shops, stores, barbershops, which obviously affects some people more than others. But and then over time, that what lasted for the better part of a couple of months. So again, very similar in that way. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Brett.
I was to say the other thing at the local level is that in Milwaukee, the socialist mayor of Milwaukee wanted to build consensus behind his additional public health measures he was taking to quarantine people, to make sure there's even less public contact because the disease was ravaging Milwaukee. And so he built a 4-person commission right away to sort of oversee this. I think people later really thought that he'd done a very strategic job because he placed 2 doctors who were experts in infectious disease and 2 local business leaders. And so from the beginning, he sort of had them working together. And because of that, there was widespread agreement with the measures that Milwaukee took.
You know, I did a little bit of research on my own just so that I appeared to be more knowledgeable than I probably am. But I found a wonderful piece of information in our Wisconsin Historical Society. It was an industrial poster from that era that talks about the 8 things to do if you want to play it safe. And it's amazing to me how things have changed and how things haven't changed. We call it social distancing today. They said, keep away from sick people, especially if you cough or sneeze. Avoid crowded streetcars, trains, or houses, and use a handkerchief when you cough or sneeze. I mean, the same kind of advice that our public health officials today are giving us. Wash your hands before eating, and keep out of dusty places. I thought that was kind of an interesting one. But what do you think? What do you think are the lessons that we can learn today from the 1918 experience? You touched on it a little bit, but what do you think the huge lessons are from if you compare the 2 outbreaks?
I think one can be that there's no question that one of the reasons that things went so well back then was 2 things: that Wisconsin, which at the time was considered a laboratory for democracy and was really leading the nation in many ways, had a very well-developed public health system. So their educational messaging to people was really probably second to none in the United States. That unquestionably had a positive outcome. Wisconsinites died at about half the rate of those infected compared to the national average. Also, there was a real spirit of cooperation, and there was almost no public backlash against this closing of public facilities. The only real concern that was expressed was amongst some Catholic churches, and that was because attending church was such an important part of the faith, and they really didn't have a virtual option as we did today. So there was some pushback there, but otherwise, you get both a belief in what government can do coming out of the Progressive era, so there was a great deal of sort of following along, and also a sense that in the context of the end of World War I, doing your duty, what we would call social distancing today, was seen as a patriotic act. And so that made it much easier, I think, to build a consensus in 1918 that made people stay at home. And so I think one of the things we can learn is that, as you said, so many things haven't changed as far as what good public health looks like in times of pandemics. And maybe one of the things that we can sort of leave this with is the idea that had we paid more attention to what they did in 1918, I think we would have been more prepared for what has come in 2020. And so that's sort of the historian getting on his bandwagon, saying, you know, we can learn a lot about from the past and sort of planning for our lives today.
You historians always trying to teach us lessons and improving our lives. I just don't know, Brett. But
guilty as charged.
Actually, we are so thrilled to have you. Thanks for being our inaugural guest. You are an awesome person and an awesome guest. So we'd like to, however, apologize to our mystery guest who's been hanging out because we've run out of time. But I have been told that they will be available next week. So we'll definitely be introducing that mystery guest next week. And speaking of next week, our featured guest for a program entitled Dealing with COVID, A View from Alexander Hamilton with Rap. Okay, I just made that last part up. We'll feature Senior WIPS Policy Fellow Paul Carver, who's an expert on Congress and worked on Capitol Hill for more years than most of us have been alive, Dave. And so he'll be our featured guest next week. If you have questions or comments and you want to participate, please email us at info@wips.org. That's WIPPS.org. And feel free to, Dave.
And I was saying, Eric, I just want to congratulate you on a great inaugural show. I'm glad it went smoothly and we were able to fill our allotted time. And that we didn't have to cut anything short. So I really appreciate that. Did you get that, Eric, cut? cut it short? That's my
Oh,
short part of
Dave,
the day.
I got it right away. And in fact, I would just retort and reply that the fringe benefits of this program are amazing. I don't know if you caught that. And basically, you know, for a viewer, Luke, I think we've reached the split end of our program. So that's going to be it. Until then, just remember that, you know, if you want a close shave, come and watch the two bald guys.